The most feared Don in New York had everything: power, territory, absolute control over a city that trembled when he breathed. Until the night they left him to bleed. She was just his mother, a retired woman trying to keep her son alive. He was dying from his wounds. And everyone knew it. His capos, his soldiers, his own brothers. They all turned their backs. But she stayed. And for staying, they called her a ghost. A relic. A woman with no weapons, no men, no power left in her soft hands. They told her Santo was already dead, he just hadn't accepted it yet. They told her to go home and grieve quietly like a proper widow's mother should. This is Roses and Revolvers, where every story cuts deeper than the last. If you made it this far and felt something, don't just watch in silence. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The real ones don't just listen to the story, they stay for the next scar. But this silver-haired woman in a green silk dress did something that night, with nothing but a telephone and 60 years of secrets, that brought the entire New York underworld to its knees. She didn't fire a single bullet. She only made one call. And the war was over before sunrise. The Milanese safe house occupied the entire top floor of a limestone building on Mulberry Street, a fortress of silence tucked inside a city that never stopped screaming. From its narrow windows, New York spread below like a wound, the amber bleed of 10,000 street lamps, the black ribbon of the East River, the distant carnival glitter of a skyline that moved, breathed, and bled under the invisible hand of Santo Milanese. Or it had. Until last Tuesday. He had built his empire the way his Calabrian grandfather had built his reputation in the hills above Reggio, not with speeches, not with spectacle, but with silence, precision, and the bone-deep patience of a man who understood that power was not taken, it was simply never relinquished. By 41, Santo controlled 4 legitimate construction companies, a shipping concern on the Red Hook waterfront, and, beneath all of it like a second circulatory system, a web of debt, territory, and sanctioned violence that kept 3 rival families, 2 city officials, and an entire harbor district in careful orbit around his name. He was not the kind of man that mythology had invented. There was no rage, no theater, no cruelty performed for an audience. Santo Milanese was broad-shouldered and still, the kind of stillness that animals read correctly as danger. His face was his father's face. Heavy jaw, dark eyes set beneath a blunt brow, a mouth that looked as though it had never once opened without intention. His hair, black going gray at the crown, was always close-cut. He wore no rings. He owned no yacht. He had never, in 20 years, raised his voice in a room that mattered. He had survived 3 attempts on his life, 2 federal investigations, and the slow collapse of every man who had ever called himself his equal. What he had not survived, what no amount of strategy or brutality had prepared him for, was the particular, surgical loyalty of people who had watched him bleed for years and simply decided, on a cold Wednesday in November, that his blood had finally run out. Now he lay in a white t-shirt soaked copper at the shoulder, a bandage taped tight across his brow, breathing in the shallow, disciplined way of a man who knows that pain is information and panic is the enemy. The room was quiet. The guards were gone. His phone had been ringing for 4 hours with calls he no longer had the men to answer. And seated beside him, holding his hand with the calm authority of someone who had held it once before, through fevers, through nightmares, through the long childhood nights when the world outside the window had seemed too large and too cruel, was Prisca Milanese. His mother, 71 years old, silver-haired, pearl-colored, dressed in deep green as though she had come from a dinner party and simply taken a wrong turn into a war zone. She was watching the city through the window, her free hand resting on the telephone beside the bed, her face wearing an expression that Santo had seen only once before in his life, when he was 9 years old and a neighbor's dog had cornered him against a fence. And she had walked out of the house without a coat, without raising her voice, and the dog had simply stopped. She was waiting. She knew something the wolves outside did not. They had forgotten who taught him everything. The door was already open when Priska arrived. Not forced, simply left that way people leave a house they never intend to return to. She stood at the threshold for exactly 2 seconds, reading the emptiness the way she once read balance sheets and men's faces, quickly, completely, without flinching. Then she walked in. The corridors smelled of cigarette smoke and something darker, copper, fear, the particular staleness of a room that had been breathing panic for hours. Coats were missing from the rack. A chair was overturned near the window. 3 untouched espresso cups sat on the kitchen counter, still warm. They had left fast. They had left together. And not one of them, not a single soldier, not a single man who had eaten at her table, kissed her cheek, called her Donna Priska with his hand pressed to his heart, had thought to call her first. She found Santo at the end of the hall. He was on the floor beside the bed, half sitting against the wall, one hand pressed to his ribs and the other lying open at his side like a man who had stopped arguing with gravity. His shirt was soaked through at the shoulder. The bandage above his eye, something improvised, already failing, had bled through entirely. His breathing was shallow, too controlled, the breathing of someone using the last of their discipline to stay conscious. Priska set her medical bag on the bed without a word. She knelt beside him, pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat, and counted. His pulse was thin and fast, a frightened thing trying to outrun something it couldn't name. His eyes found hers, and in them she saw something she had never seen in 20 years of watching her son rule this city. He looked like a boy who believed he was already dead. "Mama," he rasped. "They're coming back. An hour, maybe less. You need to leave." He gripped her wrist with what little strength remained, his eyes desperate and hollow. "They won't stop at you. They can't afford to let anyone walk out of this room." Priska looked at his hand on her wrist. Then she looked at the phone on the nightstand. Then, for the first time since she'd walked through the door, she smiled, the quiet, unhurried smile of a woman who had been waiting a very long time to make a particular call. "I know," she said softly. "So will you." She lifted him herself. Not with ease, he was 200 pounds of muscle and stubbornness, but with the particular, merciless efficiency of a woman who had long ago decided that what needed doing would be done. She got him onto the bed, cut away his ruined shirt with the small scissors from her kit, and began to work without ceremony, without trembling, without a single sound that resembled grief. Santo watched her through half-closed eyes. The wound at his shoulder was deep, a blade, not a bullet, which meant someone had gotten close enough to touch him. That thought alone cost him more than the pain did. He waited until she pressed a gauze pad against it before he spoke. "You shouldn't be here. Hold still. Mama." His voice dropped, not soft, never soft, but deliberate, the voice he used when a conversation was over. "They find you in this room. They will not hesitate. You understand me? Not for a second. Not for your age, not for your name." "Your name," she said quietly, "is my name." She pressed harder on the wound, and he exhaled sharply through his teeth. She didn't apologize. "You were not born a Don, Santo. You were born in a hospital in Palermo at 4 in the morning in the middle of a rainstorm, and I held you before your father did, before the priest did, before this city ever learned to fear you." She secured the dressing with 2 strips of tape, precise as a surgeon. "You do not get to tell me when to leave." He said nothing. For a man who had silenced rooms with a look, silence from him in this moment said everything. She was replacing the gauze above his eye when his phone, the one he'd said no one was answering, lit up on the nightstand. Neither of them moved. It rang once, twice, then stopped. 3 seconds later, the window on the far side of the room filled with the slow sweep of headlights from the street below. 1 car, then 2, then a third, all pulling to a stop at the building's entrance. Priska looked at the headlights, then at her son's face, gray, soaked in sweat, his jaw locked against the fear he would never name aloud. Then she reached past him, picked up the telephone and began to dial a number she had not called in 11 years. If you made it this far, you're not just watching, you're part of this story now. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. For miles north, in a private dining room above a restaurant that Santo himself had bought and paid for, his brother Enzo was pouring wine. Not the cheap kind. The 1998 Barolo, the case Santo had kept locked in the cellar for an occasion he never named. Enzo had found the key that afternoon. He poured it now into crystal glasses around a table set for 12, smiling the loose, unhurried smile of a man who had been waiting for this dinner his entire life and could finally taste it. The men who sat with him were not nobodies. The Ferreira family held the Eastern Docks. The Calabretti brothers ran everything above 125th Street. Between them and Enzo's own network, the table represented the largest consolidated power in the city's underworld since the old Accords of 1987. They had come because Enzo had offered terms, generous ones, and because Santo was bleeding out in a safe house with no guards and no future. To transition, Enzo said, raising his glass. And to clarity. The table drink. Someone laughed at something. A capo named Testa leaned back and said, loudly enough for all to hear, that he had always found Santo too rigid, too old world. That this, gesturing broadly at the room, at the wine, at Enzo's easy confidence, felt like breathing again. The others nodded. The oldest of the Calabrettis raised his glass a second time. The king is dead, he said. Not cruelly. Just factually, the way men in their world announced the weather. Enzo smiled and did not correct him. What none of them knew, what not one man at that glittering, treasonous table had thought to consider, was that Santo Milanese had not built his empire alone. That behind every throne in the Milanese line, going back 30 years, there had been a woman who answered to no family but her own. That she was, at this precise moment, still alive, still awake, and holding a phone to her ear in a dark room 4 miles south. And the man on the other end of that call, the one she hadn't spoken to in 11 years, the one the whole underworld believed was dead, had just said, "Tell me where." The fever came for him just after midnight, rising fast and mean, the way his father always said trouble did, without warning, without courtesy, straight for the throat. Santo's body went rigid under the thin sheet, sweat soaking through the fresh dressing on his shoulder, and then the room dissolved and his father was standing at the foot of the bed. Not the old man who had died in his armchair 11 years ago, soft and diminished and smelling of medication. The other one. The one from before, broad, dark-eyed, filling a doorway the way a storm fills a sky. He was looking at Santo the way he always had, not with love exactly, but with the particular, measuring attention of a man assessing an investment. You built it on fear, his father said. Fear rots. I told you. Santo tried to speak. His mouth wouldn't open. His father turned away. They all leave eventually. Everyone you frightened. Everyone you never trusted enough to love. Then the room flickered and he was 12 years old and watching through a cracked door as his mother talked a man twice her size into lowering a knife. No raised voice. No theatrics. Just words chosen like weapons, placed with surgical calm. The man had wept. Santo had not understood it then. He was beginning to now. The fever broke in waves. He surfaced twice, once to find Prisca pressing a cold cloth to his face, her expression closed and focused as a surgeon's, once to hear her voice, very low, speaking into the phone in a dialect he hadn't heard since childhood. Sicilian. Old Sicilian, the kind that predated borders. She was not asking for anything. She was reminding someone of something they owed. He tried to reach her arm. Couldn't. Let himself sink again. Somewhere in the dark between sleep and dying, a single thought surfaced and would not leave him. His mother had not made one call tonight. She had made several. Each one shorter than the last. Each one quieter. The quiet ones in his world were always the most dangerous. At 3:47 a.m., Her phone buzzed once with an incoming message. She read it, set the phone face down on the nightstand, and finally, for the first time in 6 hours, closed her eyes. Not to sleep. To count. When she reached 10, she stood, smoothed her dress, and picked up the phone again. It was time for the call she had been saving. He woke at dawn with the fever broken and the terrible clarity that comes after, every edge too sharp, every shadow too deliberate. His shoulder screamed when he moved. He ignored it. He reached for his phone. He called Caruso first. His most loyal capo. 15 years, not a single defection. The line rang 8 times and died. He called again. Nothing. He called Ricci, his head of security, a man who slept with one eye open and his phone in his fist. Voicemail on the second ring, present, which meant the phone was on, which meant the choice was deliberate. He called De Luca. Moretti. Fabri. Silence. 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 He set the phone down on his chest and stared at the ceiling and understood, with a completeness that no blade had ever given him, what it meant to be erased. Not killed, that he could have absorbed. Erasure was different. Erasure meant that 20 years of absolute authority, of sacrifices made and wars won and loyalty purchased at enormous cost, had been quietly revised overnight into a single verdict: irrelevant. His number was still in their phones. They simply weren't answering it anymore. He was a ghost who hadn't been told yet. Priska was watching him from the chair by the window. She had not slept. In the gray morning light her face was composed and very still, and she held the phone in her lap the way an old general holds a weapon before battle, not tightly, not eagerly, but with the settled gravity of someone who knows exactly what it is for. "They're not coming," Santo said. Not a question. "No," she said. "They're not." He looked at her. "What have you done, Mama?" She didn't answer. She looked down at the phone, scrolled once, and pressed call. It rang once, a single ring, as though the man on the other end had been waiting with his hand already on it. Then a voice, low, textured like gravel wrapped in velvet, unmistakably, impossibly alive. "Priska." A pause dense with decades. "I heard about your boy." Another pause, then quieter, and far more frightening for it. It wasn't Enzo who gave the order. The line hummed in the silence that followed. "It came from someone inside your son's own house. Someone still in that room with him right now." She didn't explain to Santo what she was about to do. She simply stood, walked to the window so the city light fell across her face, and dialed the restaurant's main line. The one printed on the menu. The one any civilian could call to book a table. She had chosen it deliberately. She wanted Enzo to understand, from the very first second, that she considered him nothing worth whispering about. The maitre d' answered. She asked, politely, to be connected to the private dining room on the second floor. There was a pause, a flicker of hesitation, and then, because her voice carried a register that made people comply before they understood why, he put her through. The room picked up mid-laughter. Glasses. Music underneath. The warm, obscene sound of men celebrating a funeral that hadn't happened yet. She waited 4 full seconds before she spoke, long enough for the noise to register her silence, for the silence to spread, for someone to say hello, in a voice that had already lost its confidence. "This is Priska Milanese," she said. That was all. Just her name. Delivered the way a judge delivers a sentence, without flourish, without anger, without any need for either. The room went quiet so fast it was almost physical. She could hear chairs shifting. Someone set down a glass with too much care. Enzo's voice came on smooth, almost amused, performing ease for his audience. "Mama, you should be home. You have 1 hour," she said. "Withdraw your men. Return what you've taken. Present yourself to your brother." A pause as precise as a scalpel. 1 hour. After that, I make a second call. And no one in that room, not you, not the Ferreras, not the Calabrettas, will be able to answer their phones either. Silence. Then laughter, real laughter, rolling and collective, the laughter of 12 powerful men who had just heard a 71-year-old woman attempt to frighten them with a telephone. Enzo's voice returned, warmer now, almost gentle. Go home, Mama. Grieve. It's over. She listened to the laughter fade. Then she said, very softly, yes, it is. She ended the call, turned from the window. And for the first time, Santos saw it, the thing behind her composure, the thing she had kept locked and buried for 30 years. Her eyes were not sad. They were not frightened. They were the eyes of a woman who had just given her enemies the only mercy she intended to offer them, and they had refused it. She picked up the phone a final time and dialed a number with no name attached, a number she had memorized in 1991 and never once written down. It rang once. A man answered in Italian. She spoke 4 words. Then she hung up. And the clock began. The call lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Santo knew because he watched the timer on her phone from across the room, counting each second the way a man underwater counts the distance to the surface. She spoke in the old Sicilian the whole time, the dialect of his grandfather's village, dense as stone, a language that hadn't been the lingua franca of anything for 50 years except, apparently, this. He heard her say his father's name. He heard her say a word he recognized dimly from childhood, il debito, the debt. Then a name that stopped his blood entirely, Conti. Old man Conti, patriarch of the oldest family in Palermo, a man so far removed from operational life that his own grandchildren believed him to be a retired vintner. She was not asking. She was reminding him of something he owed. Something from before Santo was born. Something that had been accumulating interest in the dark for 40 years, waiting for exactly this moment to be called in. The old man said 11 words. Prisca said 4. Then the call was over. What happened next did not happen in one place. It happened in 5 cities in the span of 17 minutes, the way a single stone dropped in still water reaches every edge eventually, inevitably, without asking permission. In Palermo, a phone rang at a dinner table and a man stood and left without explanation. In Naples, 3 cars rerouted mid-convoy without a word from their passengers. In New York, Caruso, the first man who had sent Santos' call to voicemail, received a text from a number he did not recognize and went pale where he stood. In the restaurant on Mulberry Street, Enzo's own lieutenant leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Enzo's wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. And in the safe house, Santos' phone, the silent, useless phone that no one had answered in 18 hours, began to ring. Not 1 call. Not 2. Every line, simultaneously, lighting up like a city coming back from a blackout. Prisca set her phone down and looked at her son. He was staring at the screen, watching name after name appear, men who had erased him 12 hours ago, men who had drunk wine over his grave, calling back now with the frantic energy of people who have just understood, too late, exactly whose son they tried to bury. She said nothing. She simply walked to the window, looked out at the city below, and waited. Because there was still one name that had not called. The one that mattered most. The one the ghost on the phone had warned her about. The traitor's still in the room. Stay with me until the end, because this story will shock you to the core. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now! They were 40 seconds from the door. 11 men in the stairwell, weapons drawn, moving in the disciplined single file of soldiers who have done this before and expect to do it again. The man at the front had his hand on the stairwell door handle. He had been given one instruction: leave no witnesses. He had accepted it without hesitation. That was 20 minutes ago, before his phone buzzed against his thigh with a message from a number that made his hand go cold on the metal. He stopped. Read it twice. Held up his fist. The column behind him froze. He turned and looked at the man directly behind him, Testa, Enzo's man, the one who had laughed loudest at the dinner table, the one who had personally delivered the order to storm the safe house. Testa was still moving forward, still reaching past him for the door handle, still operating inside a reality that had already ceased to exist. "What are you doing?" Testa said. "We move. Now." The man at the front said nothing. He simply held out his phone so Testa could read the message. Watched the color drain from his face in real time. What happened in that stairwell in the next 90 seconds was not chaos. It was its precise opposite, a cold, surgical realignment, the kind that only happens when men understand simultaneously that the ground beneath them has shifted and that the only question remaining is which side of the new ground they intend to stand on. 3 of them had received the same message. The other 8 hadn't needed to. They read it in the faces of the 3. No shot was fired in the stairwell. No shot was fired in the hallway. No shot was fired anywhere near the room where Santo Milanese lay breathing, alive, against every reasonable expectation of the last 24 hours. The coup did not end with a battle. It ended with a phone screen and a man's hand going cold on a door handle 40 seconds from a grave that never opened. Enzo was taken from the restaurant quietly, between courses, his wine still warm. He did not resist. Men who understood the name on that message did not resist. In the safe house, the silence that followed was so total that Santo could hear his own heartbeat, steadier now, fuller, the heartbeat of a man being slowly handed back his life. He looked at his mother. She was still facing the window. Still waiting. "It's over," he said. She didn't turn around. "The coup is over," she said quietly. "But the man who designed it, the one who was never Enzo, the one who used your brother as a mask, is still alive. Still watching." A pause. "And he is someone you have trusted with everything." She finally turned, and her eyes held something that had not been there before, not fear, but the particular grief of a woman about to hand her son a truth that will cost him more than the blade ever did. "I know who it is, Santo. I've known since the second call." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "You need to sit down." The sun came up over New York the way it always did, indifferent, unhurried, spreading pale gold across a city that had spent the night tearing itself apart and would spend the morning pretending otherwise. Santo watched it through the window from the bed, his shoulder bandaged clean, his breathing even, the fever gone and the clarity that replaced it sharper and more painful than anything the blade had given him. He heard them before he saw them. The low rumble of engines, too many and too deliberate for coincidence, pulling onto the street below in careful formation. He made himself sit up. Made himself look. 7 black SUVs. His men, his real men, the ones who had been rerouted, redirected, recalled by a force none of them had anticipated and none of them dared refuse. They stepped out onto the pavement in the early light and did something Santo Milanese had never seen them do. They stood still, heads bowed, hands at their sides. Not the posture of men reporting for duty. The posture of men who understood they had nearly made an irreversible error and were offering the only currency they had left, their absolute, unconditional deference. Caruso was among them. He did not look up. Santo watched for a long moment. Then he leaned back against the headboard and closed his eyes, because looking at them any longer would have required him to feel something he was not yet ready to name. He heard Prisca set the phone down on the nightstand. The final sound of it, the soft, definitive click of a weapon being holstered, filled the room more completely than any explosion could have. He felt her sit on the edge of the bed. Felt her hand, cool and certain, press once against his forehead the way she had when he was a boy burning with fever in Palermo, checking whether the worst had passed. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and said with absolute composure, "I've made you breakfast." He opened his eyes. Looked at her, this woman in green silk who had walked into a war zone with a medical kit and a telephone, and had quietly, methodically, without raising her voice a single time, saved his empire, his life, and what remained of his soul. "Mama," he said. The word came out differently than it ever had before. Not summoning her. Not dismissing her. Something closer to reverence. She paused at the doorway without turning. "When you are dawn again," she said quietly, "remember what saved you. It was not your power, Santo. It was never your power." And then she was gone, already in the kitchen, already moving with the calm efficiency of a woman who had ended a war before sunrise and had eggs to attend to. He understood then, with the full, humbling weight of it settling across his chest, that he had spent 20 years believing he ruled this city. And he did. Every street, every debt, every silence that fell when his name was spoken, all of it, his. But the woman who had just walked out of the room had let him have it. Had chosen, every single day, to stay in the background. Had maintained, in her retirement and her silence and her green silk dresses, a network of debts and loyalties and ancient obligations so vast and so deep that it made his empire look like a child's drawing of one. He was reaching for the glass of water on the nightstand when he saw it, a single folded note tucked beneath it, not in his mother's handwriting. In a hand he recognized immediately, intimately, with a cold drop of dread that hit the base of his spine like ice water. The trusted one. The name Priska had told him last night, the truth that had cost her more to deliver than anything else in that long, brutal night. The note had 3 words. He read them once, and the water glass stayed where it was. He did not call for his mother. Some things he understood now a man had to face standing up. He stood. The city waited below, golden and indifferent. The dawn straightened his spine and walked toward what came next.